disease. Uh-oh, I think it's in reverse. Sorry about that.
Mhm.
Mirror image. And this
No,
is
it
sort
was
of,
good.
you
It
saw it
wasn't
okay?
real. Yeah. Mhm.
Oh, for me, it's in mirror image, but if it's okay for you, that's good. So Ray, I'm just gonna introduce you real quick because we're gonna start the questions with you, but I want to introduce Jane and Lenny also. So Ray, I first met him on March 2nd. We were supposed to have a big event, and then coronavirus happened. And it was a delightful lunch that Denise and I had with him. And we can thank Crystal Kafka for introducing us to him. Ray is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology and the Director for the Center of Health and Technology at the University of Rochester. And Dr. Dorsey previously directed the Movement Disorders Division and Neurology Telemedicine at Johns Hopkins. His research has been published in leading medical, neurology, economic journals, and has been featured on NPR, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. So earlier this year, he and 3 other prominent Parkinson's disease experts wrote this book. And basically, it comes a little bit close to home for us here because we have a lot of Superfund sites, and there's a risk factor for developing Parkinson's if you're exposed to some of these toxins. We also have Lenny Siegel today, who's the CEO of the Center for Public Environmental Oversight. It's an organization that educates public stakeholders on both process and technologies for cleanup and environmental protection. Lenny is the former mayor of Mountain View and is an outstanding advocate for environmental and social justice issues in the Bay Area. We also have Jane Horton. She's a Mountain View resident who lives near Google. She lives in a house across the street from a Superfund site, and she found that she had elevated indoor air levels of TCE, which is a chemical associated with the increased risk of Parkinson's disease. It's also associated with increased risks of cancer and birth defects. Jane worked to set up an air remediation system in her home. She is an incredible role model and an advocate for local residents on this issue. So, about the book. So the book is basically, I think in the initial part, Ray, you talk about a Parkinson's pandemic. And it's kind of interesting that we're in a pandemic right now. Well, more than one pandemic, I guess. So the book uses history of Parkinson's, talks about stories about individuals, and it talks about prevention, advocacy, care, and treatment of Parkinson's. And I wanted to start out by asking you a question about what spurred you to write this book?
So first of all, thanks to Sarah for the invitation. She's been a relentless inviter, and I greatly appreciate it, and a relentless advocate of the work we're trying to do. Second, I got to thank Jane Horton. Jane's been on our webinars already that we've been putting on. She's featured, I think, on page 91. There's Jane outside of her home in Mountain View, California. And then I got to thank Lenny Siegel. I've never met Lenny.
Oh.
Lenny's on page 92 talking about trichloroethylene because Lenny and Jane educated me a ton about stuff I didn't know about before I wrote the book. So the book is, by the way, just a shameless plug. It's available on Amazon. You can order it right now. I think it's $18. And then all the authors are donating our proceeds to efforts to end Parkinson's. So all the authors were donating our proceeds to efforts to end Parkinson's disease. If you haven't read it, please read it. And if you've read it, please write a review on Amazon. We'd love it. So we wrote the book because Parkinson's is the fastest growing brain disease in the world. It's faster growing than Alzheimer's disease. The number of people with the disease has doubled, more than doubled in the last 25 years, and absent change will double again in the coming 25 years. The number of Americans with the disease has increased 35% in just the last 10 years. And we're failing to, one, prevent it, and we're failing to care for everyone affected, and we're failing to treat it. And so that's why we wrote it. I think if you read underneath the words, you'll see a great deal maybe of frustration that we have not gathered 1 million Americans and 6 to 7 to 10 million people around the world who have Parkinson's disease and made our voices heard. To a large extent, Parkinson's disease is preventable, and Lenny and Jane can tell you about that. And we need to do something about it. And we've done it before for polio. We've done it before for HIV. We're doing it for breast cancer. We're doing it for COVID, but we haven't done it for Parkinson's disease.
Okay, that was a great start off. So what do you think you've learned since writing the book? What would you say was the most interesting thing that you've learned since writing the book?
So in medical school and residency, you're told a little bit about the environmental factors of that contribute to Parkinson's disease, but you're not taught the whole story, or at least I didn't hear the whole story. I didn't process the whole story. Carly Tanner, who's an outstanding neurologist, used to be at the Parkinson's Institute. My guess is some of you know her. She's now at UC San Francisco. For over 20 years, she has detailed systematically the environmental risk factors linked to Parkinson's disease. She showed then 20 years ago that Parkinson's disease is predominantly an environmentally determined illness. She showed that people who are exposed to this chemical called trichloroethylene are at 500% increased risk, 6 times increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease compared to people who aren't exposed to this chemical. Just for point of reference, like when you read about something increasing risk of cancer in the newspaper, that's usually 20% risk. This is 500% increased risk. And so I learned a ton about these environmental risk factors and how much they're fueling it. And it led me to the conclusion that Parkinson's disease is largely a man-made disease. We're giving it to ourselves. We are giving Parkinson's disease to ourselves. And to the extent it's man-made, we can end it.
Okay, so maybe I can get you to talk a little bit about what is TCE, and maybe Lenny can sort of also chime in on like what are its uses and why is it here?
I'll start a little bit. Lenny knows more than I do because I interviewed him to learn more. So TCE is a very simple compound. It has 2 carbon atoms, 3 chlorines, and 1 hydrogen. It's been around since the 1920s. It's used to do everything from as an anesthetic for women, especially during childbirth. It's been used to decaffeinate coffee. It's used as a paint degreaser. It's used by mechanics. It's used in refrigeration. It's widely used in Silicon Valley and found in 15 Superfund sites in Silicon Valley, and 21 Superfund sites in Silicon Valley, 15 of which are on this map. So if you live in, I don't know if you can read that, if you live in Mountain View and Sunnyvale, you live right near a Superfund site contaminated with trichloroethylene.
I can do the share screen, I think.
Including Jane lives across the street from one. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lenny.
Well, trichloroethylene is known as kind of the universal solvent that was used by many industries, electronics industry here, aerospace industry. After the leaks and spills were discovered in the 1980s, it was largely phased out by the major industries, but it still seems to be used by certain metal industries, like metal tubing industries. And it's also found in some commercial products. Gun cleaner, it's a carrier for pepper spray, and it's not outlawed. California has been gradually restricting it. This year, Minnesota actually outlawed the use of TCE, but otherwise it's allowed. One of the things about it, we call it a volatile organic compound, and that means it evaporates. And that's significant because the major risk around here of exposure to TCE is not in drinking water, because we don't allow people to drink it. We shut off the wells that are contaminated, but for vapor intrusion, where it's actually sucked up into buildings overlying contaminated soil and groundwater.
Okay, and then somebody had a question about this. So one of the people watching today, Amy, is a veteran who was stationed at Camp Lejeune.
Oh.
And she was diagnosed in 2017. Basically, one of her questions is about water and, using some kind of filter for bathroom and kitchen water. And when is that appropriate?
Is she on?
I think Amy's here, but I don't know if she's,
Oh, hey, Amy.
yeah.
Lenny, you want to start or you want me to go?
You start.
So Camp Lejeune is a Marine base in South Carolina.
North Carolina.
North Carolina, thank you. And it was grossly contaminated with a chemical trichloroethylene and a closely related chemical called perchloroethylene. The military knew about it. The military knew it was harmful, knew the risks, and did nothing about it, or did little about it. As a result, there's a cemetery in Camp Lejeune that's filled with children from miscarriages and children born with neural tube defects. There are large numbers of people who have cancer who served on this Marine base, and there are people who have Parkinson's disease. The TCE and PCE, some of it came from a dry cleaners. You can imagine if you're on a military base, there's lots of dry cleaning of uniforms. And so that was one source, but not the only source of trichloroethylene. The trichloroethylene contaminated the water. TCE contaminates up to 30% of groundwater in the United States. Is the most common organic groundwater contaminant in the United States. So people drink the water and are at risk for cancer, neural tube defects, stillborn children, and Parkinson's disease, among other conditions. And then it's also comes into your house, and then when you take a shower and you heat the water, it's more likely to evaporate, so you inhale it. So people on the base were getting it in 3 different routes of exposure: consuming it on their skin and inhaling it. It's one of the great tragedies of our time. The story has been somewhat told. We tell it in the book in chapter 5 of it, and people like Amy and others have bared a very high price and almost all of them are parts of military families who are doing service for our country.
So Camp Lejeune is unusual in that the people responsible for delivering the water didn't shut it off. Most places, when they discover TCE in drinking water and tap water, they'll find another source. Camp Lejeune was an anomaly in that sense, because people rotate through, in the military, rotate through a base. A huge number of people were exposed. The only saving grace is some of them were only exposed for 2 or 3 years. So the duration of exposure was less. In terms of the issue of taking showers, you can't protect yourself simply by drinking bottled water, because you're actually exposed to more fumes if TCE is in your tap water through showering or heating water on your stove than you are from actually drinking the water. Although I've characterized the differential risk between teenage boys and teenage girls as enormous, because teenage boys don't take showers and teenage girls take very long ones. So your exposure is determined not just by what you drink, but by the use of water in your house.
Lenny, can I have a second here?
Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. When I was at a stakeholders conference in San Diego, it was for people talking about TCE, and the responsible polluting parties each had an hour, and individuals like myself had 5 minutes. There was a brother and sister there from Oregon, and with them they had their father's ashes. Their father had worked at the Mattel toy company up in Oregon, and all the employees there, unbeknownst to them, had been drinking, hand washing, constantly exposed to water with TCE, and all of them ended up dying horrible deaths with tumors in their throats, horrible cancerous tumors. Mattel shut down that factory and moved it down to Mexico. But having the brother and sister talk from their heart about the horribleness of what happened to their father drinking that contaminated water was just heartbreaking.
Sarah, I just wanted to break in and say we've
Sure.
got a lot of questions on this topic, so I thought I'd put some out there if I could. And I will let Ray, Lenny, and our other guests pop in. One question is, has there been any correlation seen directly between cancer, particularly breast cancer, since so many women are here, and PD prevalence with TCE exposure?
First, can I hear from Amy and hear her story on Camp Lejeune? And then I'll answer cancer.
Okay, I'll give you a quick one. I was stationed there in 84 to 87. I was a clinical dietitian down in the basement of the hospital on Paradise Point by the waterfront. I was also an officer. I lived in the bachelor officer quarter on the water at the New River, where the water spill had occurred from the ABC cleaners across the way. That was the dry cleaner that is purported to have released a lot of TCE and maybe some other, substances. I didn't have any neurological or other symptoms that I knew of from 1987 until about 2017, other than Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, which I was diagnosed in 2003. And I'd be interested to know over time if other people have that duality. But I don't know, that's about it. There's a lot of people coming out of the woodwork right now because of the excellence of the book. I had a radio Parky program where I was actually interviewed, as well as a Marine that was stationed there the same time as I was, and it was fascinating. We have completely different symptomology, but we're in the same boat together, and we're trying to get the word out, getting people to read the book, take action. We're trying to understand if there's anything we can do at a later stage like this, such as changing to whole house filtration, so that we remove extra substances when we shower, cook, drink water. And we're trying to find out if we should be, eating a whole lot differently other than healthy, eating the rainbow, nutritious foods, exercising. Should we be taking any of these binders like the clinoliptolite? It's basically a zeolite product, popular with the functional medicine physicians. I don't know if it's kind of hokey. Is it too late to try to absorb or chelate these substances in our body to get rid of them? I kind of think it is. So I'll let you and Lenny answer that, Dr. Dorsey and Mr. Siegel.
So do we start, Lenny, or?
You go.
So the last question, I want to get to Amy's, and then I think it was Laura's. So since writing the book, I've added water filters to my house because there are, not only are there half of Superfund sites contaminated with TCE and Camp Lejeune, there are thousands, including one 15 minutes from my house that was contaminated with TCE. And TCE carbon filters, the standard filters that you get at the supermarket, have been shown, I think, to decrease your risk of TCE exposure. Lenny probably knows more than I do. I think there have been some studies linking thyroid disease to TCE. I'm just trying to do it in real time. And I'll try to look and see if I get more. The other question was about cancer and Parkinson's disease. So TCE aside, in general, people with Parkinson's disease are at lower risk for cancer, and it might be because people with Parkinson's disease tend to be less likely to smoke and therefore have less likely risk of getting lots of different cancers tied to smoking. TCE is a carcinogen by all routes of exposure. It's a class 1 carcinogen. That's the worst level that there is. It's linked with numerous cancers, especially renal cell cancer. I don't know about links specifically to breast cancer. I can't remember in doing the research about breast cancer being especially common, but that could be because I've forgotten or didn't investigate it.
So the cancers that are most often associated with TCE are non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, liver cancer, and kidney cancer. The data on others seems to be uncertain. Jane mentioned the site in Oregon. They did an exhaustive study, and they found for some cancers, men were at greater risk. For some cancers, women were at greater risk, but it wasn't enough to be conclusive. We're basically guinea pigs. We'll all be dead and gone before they know what caused it. So, it's something that causes problems. You can't guarantee that it doesn't cause it, but there's no overwhelming evidence that I've seen that it causes breast cancer. So in terms of filtering water, there may be other reasons to filter water. In a place like Mountain View where I live, we have a public water supply. It is not only do we monitor the water supply, we monitor the groundwater between our water supply and the contamination sites. So there's no reason based on TCE to filter our water. If you're a place with private wells where there are industrial sites nearby, like Hopewell Junction, New York, that's what EPA supplied, is whole, carbon filters for the entire house. One thing about TCE, and this is a major difference with PFAS compounds, which are in the news a lot today. TCE does not remain in your body. It's metabolized, it's excreted, whereas PFAS is a forever chemical and you can measure it in your kid's blood forever. So, so getting it out of your body, it's already gone by the time you know about it in most cases.
Good to know.
Great.
And there was an additional question, Sarah. Does WD-40, is that you were talking about universal solvents, and a question was asked, is WD-40 a problem with TCE? It has been. I'm not sure whether they're still using it. There should be a label on the can. In one of the Mountain View sites, there was they brought in a can of plastic cement that they said was the source of TCE in a house. It wasn't coming from the groundwater. And it was a closed can. Gun cleaner's one that has a lot of TCE. So it can be in consumer products. You can go and buy it, but in a lot of places they've been taking it out. TCE is also can help cause smog, ozone. So California hasn't restricted it as a carcinogen, but by protecting our outdoor air, they've reduced the use of TCE in consumer products. But it's not true everywhere.
I had a quick question for Lenny. I guess this is all for all of you. So this was from Crystal, and Crystal, I don't know if you want to unmute now and ask your question. So basically, Crystal lives on a street where there are perhaps there's a cluster of people with Parkinson's, one child with a brain tumor, and she doesn't live on a specific Superfund site or near a Superfund site. So the question is, how do you find out the non-Superfund sites, and also how do you get your house tested?
Well, two things. I saw Crystal's email just as we were starting. She lives down gradient from the co-Superfund site, Hewlett Packard on Page Mill. I don't know that it extends as far as her house, but Terradex, which is located in Palo Alto, has maps of plumes here in Silicon Valley. And after the call, I'll check to see whether there's a known plume near her house. She's in a residential area, but it is, again, down gradient, which means it's downstream underground. So if the plume is moving toward the bay, the contamination can move. And if you're within, let's say, 100 feet of a known groundwater plume, then that does put you at risk of vapors from vapor intrusion. Her drinking water, as far as I know, is safe. So it's a matter of whether or not there's a pathway from a known plume to her neighborhood. When I was on the Mountain View City Council, we would approve developments of housing and offices all over town, and a majority of the major development sites had contamination of PCE or TCE. The big ones had TCE, and the small ones had PCE from former dry cleaners. So there are a lot of contamination spots around here. Most of them have been identified, and it's contamination in the upper aquifers that we're concerned about for vapor exposure that is near the surface. So I'll see what I have sometime later today, but it's called informally the COE for California, Oregon, maybe it's El Camino. I don't think it's Emerson Superfund site, which is again down gradient from Hewlett Packard. I did look at that site when there was planned housing development on Birch Street. I'll have to look up that, but that is up gradient from Bryant Street. And I know Bryant because you're at Bike Boulevard.
Right. And we do have a waterway under our houses. It's the people who put the what do they call it? The piers, the posts that.
For the foundation.
Yeah, I can't remember. For the foundation, said that just 5 feet down from the surface is water, and the houses sort of roll on it, if you will, seasonally. So lots of cracks and so forth.
So I'll see what I can find out what's known about the groundwater plume in your area.
Okay, thank you.
It's
Jane, you want to talk about what these plumes are and what they can do?
well, see, what happens normally is TCE is released. Somebody could dump it on the ground like they did at Moffett Field, or there was an underground storage tank for either TCE or waste that contained TCE, or maybe there was a sewage line that they dumped the TCE down and it leaked through that. That's what happened a few blocks from Jane. And it goes, the contamination goes into the groundwater, and it basically mixes with the groundwater, and it moves with the groundwater, forming a plume. Now, plume is from the word for feather, French word for feather. So basically it's shaped like a cigar or a feather, and the contamination moves underground along with the groundwater. And then any place and if it's in the shallow groundwater, any building that's above that is at risk, because the TCE, as I said originally, volatilizes, and it forms a gas in the soil. It's called soil vapor or soil gas. So soil isn't just dirt. There are pores with vapor within it, and the TCE or other volatile compounds fill up those pores, so you have this gas underground. And then if you have a house above it, the house has a negative air pressure relative to the vapor pressure in the soil. It actually sucks up the contamination. So, people worry about plumes under parks. That's not a big deal. It's plumes under houses or schools that are an issue, because they actually pull up the contamination. So again, there's a release up gradient at Hewlett-Packard, and it heads toward the bay. Any home that is above it is at risk of vapor intrusion, but we don't know how far. I don't know how far that plume went. Once they start trying to clean up these sites, they don't do a very good job of cleaning it up. It's almost impossible, but they can keep the plume from moving by pumping the groundwater out, and that's what they've been doing in most of the Silicon Valley sites. So again, we have to find out how far that plume has moved.
Okay, I have a question for Jane. Can we hear your story, Jane?
Yes, it's kind of, bear with me because I'll give you some context from the past and then moving forward. I bought my house in Mountain View in 1975, and it was a little 2-bedroom farmhouse, and it was across the street from Fairchild on Wisman Road in Mountain View. And it was just really exciting. I moved there. At the time, I only had 2 children, and I had been there for 25 years when in the year 2000, I think it was the year 2000, there was talk in the neighborhood of the EPA hosting meetings because there was contaminated groundwater at the GTE site, which is about a 1/4 mile from me. And the new townhomes there, the owners were very concerned, and EPA was having meetings. So I started attending these meetings, and lots of distrust to the EPA, lots of angry people, lots of frustrated people. And several meetings into it, I heard about the MEW plume, and I didn't know what that was. And that was the Middlefield, Wisman, Ellis Street plume that was across the street from me that I knew nothing about. Fairchild had been closed for years, and there was a chain link fence around it. But I did not know, after living there for 25 years, that I was across the street from a plume. So I continued to go to the meetings. There was an election for Citizens Advisory Group to the EPA, and I got elected to that. I was on the east side of Middlefield, and the other homes were on the west side of Middlefield, and I was the only one in our neighborhood, which is a lot of rentals, a lot of apartments, a lot of non-English speaking people. And it was quite a challenge to get people engaged when I found out about this plume. So I would sit there at meetings horrified, you know, we can send a man to the moon. Why can't we clean up this water? Trying to keep my energy going, because same charts, same speakers, people talking about, well, a baby that weighs this much and has this breathing weight can be exposed to TCA to this amount. And you're sitting going, what world is this coming from? Why are these people talking this nonsense? Let's just get this cleaned up. And how can you say any of this is safe? And I could not have my indoor air tested because my front door was 20 feet away from the edge of the plume. And at that time, there's very few testing that was done. It was in Sumi canisters. 2 people had to come out to your house, sign it off, open up a canister, come back 24 hours later. It got sent off to a lab. It was very expensive, complicated, expensive process. And so I did not qualify to have my indoor air tested. My home, built in 1895, has an earthen cellar, which goes about 10 feet down into the ground. And groundwater below that is very close to it. Again, I knew nothing about vapor intrusion. I had to develop a whole nother vocabulary, learn all sorts of things that I'd never heard of before. And sitting at one of the meetings, I looked at their map of the plume and I was shocked. Oh my God, the plume has moved. It is now underneath my house. But that's not what happened. They were just testing more wells. And as they tested more wells that were closer to my house, then they would redraw the lines on the map. And they had different maps for different levels of groundwater and where the plume was. But I was like, what happened? What happened? Why did the plume change? It didn't. The plume was there underneath my house all the years I'd lived there. It's just they hadn't mapped out the plume as much. And as there was more public pressure and more people involved in this, they were doing more mapping. So at that point, my home did qualify for indoor air testing. And I said, of course I want to know what my air is like. I'm assuming it's fine. You know, I've lived here for 25 years. You know, let's be optimistic. And they had already at this point pumped out 100,000 pounds of TCE, if you can visualize what that is like. So they were 75% remediated. And when my results came back, my indoor air was 3.9 times the protective health rate that it should be. So I then qualified to have remediation for my indoor air. And I could only imagine how bad it had been before the 100,000 pounds had been taken out of the ground. I'll take a breath now for a moment. Lenny, is there anything that you want to add to that before I talk about the remediation and how that happened?
Just want to mention that when we looked at the sampling they had done that showed that Jane was outside of the plume, it's like down the street a couple blocks there was 50 parts per billion of TCE in groundwater, and then the other direction there was 1 part per billion, and they kind of drew a line between them with no real data. And this is often a problem on the edge of a plume. They were focused on the greatest concentrations, which were in the industrial area, but they were not at that point doing an adequate job of delineating the plume, that is finding the boundary. Later, again, a few blocks north of Jane, they discovered a whole new branch of the plume. It's really from a sewage line, trying to fill in the blanks.
So I'll continue, because once they...
I'm gonna try to take it in the other room. Okay.
Once they decided that my home qualified for remediation, this is an old home. New homes, it's much, much different. They can just put down a vapor intrusion pad. It's very easy with new construction, but every home that's existing is unique and they need to figure out what to do. So they basically cut many holes around the foundation of my house, kind of butchering it all up, and put a huge fan system in the cellar, which initially was running 24/7, and I couldn't stand it. It was like a huge monster shaking my house. And when they came back and retested, they had actually increased the amount of TCE in my home because they were just sucking in air. So then they had to figure out, oh, well, we need to cut some more holes and put a a big vent that goes up above the roof line because we're sucking in ambient air, and which is the outdoor air, and now we're going to take the air from the cellar and put it out above the roof line. So once that happened, this is probably 18 months after they had said, yes, your home test positive. They were able to lower the amount of TCE in the home to below what was the protective health risk range. I then got a bill for $4,500, which they said, oh, whoops, that shouldn't have gone to you. But there was 9 responsible polluting parties, and they would be coming to meetings or sending their representatives to the meetings, all trying to figure out who was going to pay for things. And it was really frustrating. It would trip the machine. I finally got them and said, I can't stand it 24 hours a day, just do this 12. It would trip the breakers in my house, and it made my electricity bill go up. And after several years, they finally agreed to reimburse me for the electricity. Several years later, they came in and put in a new breaker box. Now, in the last year, they've got a modem, a computer, a panel on the side of the house with lights, and they can monitor the system remotely, which is a big, big difference from almost 20 years ago when I was, digging at them to do things and help and pay for it themselves. And now things are a little bit different. And since the EPA Region 9 says now if you live with 100 feet within a plume, you can get your indoor air tested for free. That's been a huge win when they made that change.
And I got to say that Jane's testimony on this, or speaking about this, not only helped herself out, it helped set standards around the country for how people were treated. Making people pay for the electricity, for example, just crazy. So Jane did more than take care of herself.
Thank you, Lenny.
I want to add something about the Palo Alto site. There was a groundwater extraction system at the Oregon Expressway underpass, which is near your house, Crystal, and because I think that's below sea level. So they were taking the water that drains there and extracting it for treatment. We'll have to find out whether that treatment actually released contaminants into the air. Across the street from Jane, near Walker Drive, which is the cluster that we know about in Mountain View, they used to have these air treatment towers. They look like the Rocket to the Moon ride at Disneyland. And all they were doing to treat the TCE and groundwater that they'd extracted is they were releasing it into the air. Although the exposure levels would have been very low, we didn't think that was a good idea. But before they were able to sample the air, they shut it down when we started to complain about it. But anyhow, we've got to do some research on the Oregon Expressway underpass.
Yeah.
So Lenny, are you a good resource for people to ask, like if they are concerned that they might be living in a place that is near a plume or under or over a plume? Are you good with that?
And Bob Wenslow, whose office is in Town and Country Village with Terradex, he's the one who does the mapping. And ironically, Town and Country Village has underground VOC contamination.
It seems like it's everywhere.
This is all preventable. All of it. All of it's preventable.
Yeah, it is kind of shocking to think that there's so much in our area, our geographic area. Yeah.
And Sarah, I just want to say, Amy put in a great resource about where you can find out toxins. Thanks, Amy. And also put several things about tap water as well as location. It's the Tox map, and there's a link right there. So it's a great resource.
It came from page 204 of the book.
Yeah.
It sounded familiar to you, right, Dr. Dorsey?
So the advantage of the Terradex maps is they actually draw boundaries for plumes as opposed to just putting a point on the map where the regulators have said this is the site. And those plume maps are really important. when you deal with some of these large industrial and military bases. They show a spot on the map, but the plume may have gone several miles. The one at MEW by Jane's house is 1.5 miles long and 1/2 mile wide.
And Lenny's website, cpeo.org, has a wealth of information too. I spent some time writing the book, reading it.
So, in 2002, 2003, when Jane and I met, when EPA was starting to investigate vapor intrusion, I've been working on that site for groundwater issues for nearly 20 years. And I had to learn about vapor intrusion. So now my work since then has been trying to translate this rather technical area of engineering and toxicology, et cetera, into language that people understand. So you can go to my site and see the Stakeholders Guide to Vapor Intrusion and offshoots of that, where I've tried to, I'm not really a scientist for this stuff. I'm a translator.
So Ray has been putting all of these resources on our chat, so everyone just be aware of that. It's kind of like doing stuff as we're talking, which is great. Does anybody have some other questions about, oh, wait a minute, here we go, here's a question. Amy has a question about whole house filters to choose from. Do you know anything about that, Lenny or Ray or Jane?
So
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I have a quote unquote whole house filter in the remediation system, but that's not something that is practical or going to work for everybody. I know one of the things, ironically, that I think has helped protect my family and myself is I'm a great open all my doors and windows person. And because TCE vapors get trapped in homes, having opened windows and doors and good ventilation, there's so many toxics in our homes anyway. If you have any like formaldehyde that comes out of particle board, any things, new rugs, adhesives, the paints, all of those, I think just opening doors and windows, if you don't have a filter, is a immediate help.
Okay, great. Wow. And somebody had a question on our chat. I'm sorry if I was kind of a little late on this, figuring out how to use the chat, about how we organize in the future. I mean, I think as a group of people with Parkinson's, we're also pretty engaged and interested in this topic. Is there any move in our state, Lenny, to look at banning TCE, or is there anyone interested in that topic?
So in California, it seems like it's not being done legislatively, but gradually under the air pollution controls. Since most of the industries that have used TCE have phased them out because of the cost of cleanup, what's more important now is to make sure that the state guidance that governs the cleanup of old sites is strengthened. And I recently submitted comments to Cal EPA on that topic. They are improving what they're doing, but there's a constant battle with polluters and the producers of this chemical, not so much over Parkinson's, but over the fetal heart risk. EPA found in 2009, I can't remember what year it was, maybe it was 2012, that TCE in low concentrations can cause fetal heart malformations, birth defects in fetuses. And that's significant because most of the things we're talking about, like for Amy, people were exposed for a long time and eventually they get a disease from it. Fetal heart malformations are caused during the first trimester of pregnancy. And that means that you're no longer interested in averaging exposure over a long period of time. it means an exposure for 1 or 2 days could cause the problem. And that means you have to monitor more, you have to be more restrictive in exposures because of the short-term exposure. And industry has been fighting like hell and using the Trump administration to try to remove that. So on the federal restrictions on TCE in products, this is not for cleanup at Superfund, but they have been somewhat successful in weakening the standard and ruling out what EPA found in its what they call an IRIS study. So there's ongoing battles over the toxicology, and it seems rather obscure, but in fact, that makes a difference when you start going to somebody like Jane's house and saying, how often should we be sampling the air in that house? Because it only takes a spike on the wrong time of the month to cause a fetal heart malformation. And people say, well, if this were a problem, we'd have, everybody would have heart defects. Well, it turns out a lot of people have heart defects and they don't know about it until much later in their lives. So there are ongoing battles. If you contact me through my website or Siegel at cpeo.org, we have an internet discussion list. I don't use social media as much as I use discussion lists, but we have a network of people from all over the country who are working on this issue. I work with the women in White Bear Township in Minnesota, where these were people being exposed to emissions. A company that makes fishing tackle was emitting TCE into their air at unsafe levels. And these women organized and they got the state legislature and the governor to enact a law outlawing the use of TCE in Minnesota. So there are a lot of people working on this. Right now, people are focused on other risks, but this risk is going to be with us for a long time.
Can I chime in a couple things? One, that the link doesn't work because I think the present administration defunded the ToxMap link after the fact. So
Of course.
you can actually, I think if you go to the National Library of Medicine, I think who was responsible for it, you can read some articles on that. Two, I'll just read a brief excerpt from the book. So those who have been and are being exposed to TCE are tired of waiting. Senator Tom Udall, who's from New Mexico, whose uncle, Congressman Morris Udall, had Parkinson's, is pressuring the EPA to ban TCE. In August 2018, Senator Udall held a press conference with families. They shared stories of loved ones passing away from diseases that have been linked to the solvent and emphasized the need for swift action. EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, who's still the EPA Administrator, said, quote, absolutely, we need to be moving forward to do something on TCE and these other chemicals. As of July 2019, the EPA has yet to act. And as of June 2020, the EPA has yet to act. If 1 million people with Parkinson's disease told the EPA to act, they would act.
So there was a question on the chat about, Jane, about your neighbors. So you had a couple of neighbors with Parkinson's also, right?
Well, Lenny mentioned the air stripper. When that air stripper, which looked like a rocket ship, it was at where a street, like a T intersection, it was right across from Walker Avenue. And that was a home of mostly post-war GI Bill home buyers, their first home. So these were older people. A lot of them were, they were retired at this point and their kids had grown up and left. But the Mountain View Voice, our local paper, had an article about on that one street. Lenny, you can remember the figures maybe better than I can, but there was 3 or 4 people with Parkinson's, somebody with a brain tumor, and they were right down the street from where the TCE was going straight into the air. And that was one of the articles that I think people got galvanized. The air stripper, as Lenny said, came down before there was an opportunity to test the outdoor air. And those people, by and large, at this point, weren't interested in talking to the EPA. They were very disillusioned. They didn't trust what the government was doing to keep them safe. And EPA would go through the neighborhoods trying to talk to people. And if you could get somebody to talk to you often, they were renters who did not have the authority to authorize you to get their indoor air tested, because if you just rent, you can't do that. The homeowner has to give permission to get the indoor air tested. And we ran into many homeowners saying, no way, because that's going to drop my home property values if people find out that I have dirty air, instead of feeling like I do, like I've got the most clean air in the city of Mountain View right now because of this, remediation system. But people were scared that their property values would drop. And I kind of went off topic there a little bit, but that was the first indication of Parkinson's. And the other thing is,
it was so early that there were no scientific studies
right,
suggest that TCE was a risk factor in Parkinsonism. So they dismissed it. If it happened today, we have the science say, wait a minute, you ought to do more of an investigation.
So 2 notes on that. Just like Amy's case, she was exposed to TCE, I think you said in the 80s, and then, 80s. And then, 20 years has developed with Parkinson's. That's the classic, is that you're exposed to these toxins, TCE. We haven't even talked about certain pesticides, also very common in Northern California. You get exposed to these things in your early, sometimes as a child, and then you develop the disease decades later, because the disease takes decades to unfold. Similarly, not everyone with the exposure gets the disease. Not everyone who smokes gets lung cancer. Only 10% of smokers develop lung cancer, so there's clearly other factors that play, environmental and genetic, but these things increase your risk. You take away smoking, you take away lung cancer, you take away TCE, pesticides, air pollution, heavy metals, and welding, you're going to wipe away a lot of Parkinson's disease, if not the vast majority of it.
One more thing is that eventually EPA did sample over 100 homes in Jane's neighborhood, and most of them came up acceptably low. There was one home that was between, that we thought deserved mitigation like Jane was getting, but EPA said no, it wasn't quite high enough. And we were fighting that, and then we discovered that the guy had gun cleaner in his closet. We dropped the issue.
And so 6 people in Jane's neighborhood were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, 4 with cancer and with brain tumors. And then we're investigating, unless you think this is only in Silicon Valley, we're investigating a cluster of what we think is Parkinson's disease due to TCE in Rochester, New York.
But because it wasn't drinking water, but the drinking water was not contaminated, we had no way of reconstructing the dose. The calculations of the emissions from the airstrip or the tower were that it was extremely low. And we had no way to go back and say whether these people had actually been exposed, because they didn't do sampling at the time they came forward with their reports of disease. Whereas at Camp Lejeune, where there was a drinking water exposure, we know what was in the water historically.
Okay, wow. Any other questions or things that people want to ask about?
I'll just say, my goal here is to end Parkinson's disease. So if I can help anyone in their efforts, I'm happy to help. We have a website, endingpd.org. And if people have questions, they can just email us at info@endingpd.org. Or you can just ask Sarah what my email is and she'll give it to you. And then if anyone wants a copy of the book and doesn't have the financial means to do so, probably not the biggest thing in Silicon Valley, we give away free copies of the book. You just email us at info@endingpd.org. and we'll send you a copy. Likewise, if you have friends, family members who don't have the financial resources, we're happy to send the book to them.
I have one thing to add in that one of the key studies that links Parkinsonism to TCE exposure was done in Berea, Kentucky. And I actually was in Berea, Kentucky as part of a National Academy of Sciences committee looking at the chemical weapon storage facility there. And I met one of the people who was part of that study. He was going downhill very fast. What was disappointing, and then I got the New York Times to report this, is although he had Parkinson's disease and he'd been dipping his arms in TCE in a factory, the University of Kentucky researcher who made his name showing the relationship between TCE and Parkinsonism wouldn't certify him for workers' compensation. You're better off hurting your back than getting an occupational disease from a chemical exposure.
Wow.
And we tell that whole story in the book. I didn't know, Lenny, you were behind that story. We tell that whole story in the book. Lenny, I hope you received a copy of the book.
I got it. I got
Okay,
it.
good.
Thank you.
Jane, likewise, I hope you received a copy.
Yes, I did. Thank you. And I just want to throw in a comment about Lenny, that for those of you who don't know him, he has been a tireless activist for many decades. And he did get recognition from President Obama for his work in environmental, just the integrity that he has. And it's not even nationally, it's also internationally. So, you know, one of the things I think we all can do is try to be more informed, but even things like writing postcards or telephone calls to people in government. They want to get reelected. They want to do what their constituents want. And the more people that are making that wheel squeak, the people that have been elected want you to be happy. So like Dr. Dorsey said, if you get 1 million people calling or writing or doing letters to the editors, it's very powerful, and you can create the change, and you can get lots of things done, although it's very slow and it's very frustrating.
We say the
That's how
squeaky
change
wheel gets rid
happens.
of the degreaser.
I get the degreaser.
Yeah.
And that's how change happened. That's how change happened with polio. Think about HIV, right? You know, think about COVID and HIV. So when HIV was running rampant and killing people by the hundreds, there was no federal response whatsoever. People were blamed for the disease that they were getting, unknowingly getting. HIV was unknown. AIDS was rapidly fatal and incurable. And the span of 15 years, they took this unknown fatal condition and turned it into one of the most treatable conditions in the world. More treatable. More people are appropriately treated for HIV than for Parkinson's disease. And the life expectancy associated with HIV is near normal.
Yeah. So there were a couple of questions here, just a few minutes left. One was, is there any way to currently detect exposure to TCE in the body, like currently, like going on?
Lenny, I don't know. If Lenny's going to tell me, I'm going to listen. Do you know, Lenny, if there is?
I don't think there is any.
So
The one thing we know is that TCE is metabolized in the liver very similarly to alcohol. So when you try to do epidemiology, you have to look at the ethnic background of the people you're studying.
There are some researchers at the University of Pittsburgh, Brianna D. Ray and Tim Greenemeyer. There might be genetic modifications that occur in response to TCE that might be able to assess, but that's not there yet, but that's stuff that we're...
The other thing is we're all exposed to TCE at extremely low levels. It is in our ambient air in any metropolitan area. We were able to lower it through the work we've done over the years. It used to be much higher. It used to be close to the action level that EPA has now for the vapor intrusion sites, but it was used so widely that it was in our outdoor air at unsafe levels.
And the Netherlands lowered their air levels and their rates of Parkinson's went down.
And another way to ask about this also is just looking at it from another angle would be, if you were able to diagnose Parkinson's earlier and you knew that there was a cohort of people that were exposed to TCE, would you have a way of like linking them better? And is there anything on the horizon that you think is promising, Ray, about early diagnosis of Parkinson's?
Well, so there's the California surveillance registry that's going to, that things in place now that tracks everyone who's diagnosed with Parkinson's, so you can map who has the disease and map it to environmental risk factors, especially pesticides and TCE. You know, in the book, we detail what you can do to decrease your risk of Parkinson's disease: exercise, caffeine, avoiding head trauma. We tell you those things. Early treatments for early Parkinson's disease, you know, I still think we're a little way away. We've had no therapeutic breakthroughs, major therapeutic breakthroughs this century in Parkinson's disease. No major therapeutic breakthroughs in this century. We had more last century than we had this century. We're just not doing it in the right way. The status quo is not working. If we continue to follow the status quo and have hope in the status quo, nothing's going to change except more of your friends and family members are going to be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease.
So in terms of studies of clusters, unfortunately, bad news is good news. So a situation like Crystal's neighborhood, that's something that we know how to study. You identify the people and you figure out how they might have been exposed. These statistical surveys, and they did it for Jane's neighborhood, is they look at a census tract and they count the number of cancers in the census tract. And those census tracts had very little correlation to the distance from the contamination. So they came up with a rather uneven result. In one 5-year period, there was a higher level of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but not in the other periods. And the other cancers were at lower rates. But there's really no data about people who were exposed. Whereas if you have individuals and you can track them, and this is, to some degree what they did at Camp Lejeune, then you can do a much more useful study.
One of the things too about registries that was frustrating is they were trying with the TCE registry, and it's voluntary for the doctors to put in information, and it often puts in the location of where the patient died. So they might die in a convalescent home 10 miles from where they grew up. They might have been exposed to TCE at their work. They might have been moving around many places. It's really hard to figure out where the exposure actually came from.
Excellent point.
Sarah, I got to run in like 1 minute. Do you have a last question?
I think we're actually we're good here, and thank you so much. I mean, I'm so thankful to you, Ray, for your time, and Lenny and Jane. Awesome discussion. I will be putting out to everyone an email with the information that was on the chat, and then a link to a recording of this meeting.
And I'm happy to come back. I'm happy to do it again. I'm happy to do a book club. I'm happy to do whatever is necessary for us to end Parkinson's disease. Generations before ended polio, and we benefit for it. Generations before have prevented many of us and many of our kids from developing HIV. MAD prevented lots of us and lots of our kids from getting killed by drunk drivers. We should do the same thing for Parkinson's disease.
Just remember what Margaret Mead said, what a small group of people can do.
That's right.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you for having me.
Get the book. It's
Yes.
awesome.
Shameless
Lots of
plug for
tips.
the book. All right.
Lots of links in there. Lots of links in there. It makes it easy to do. Bye, y'all.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for having me.